This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month, we'll have a theme. This month, we look back at the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy. Each week, we'll pick a movie related to that theme. This week, we look at 2017's War for the Planet of the Apes.
You're him. You're Caesar.
I did not start this war, but I will finish it.
You are impressive, but you're taking this much too personally. So emotional!
Apes together, strong.
My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4- or 5-star review so as to help people discover the show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, we are looking at yet another movie from 2017. We have spent a lot of time in this year from our time reviewing superhero movies on Superhero Pantheon. And on that podcast, we discussed movies such as Wonder Woman, Logan, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Thor Ragnarok. So we have spent a lot of time, and man, it just seems like 2017 might be one of the greatest years for genre movies ever.
Yeah, that summer was like unbelievable. Because like Logan, I remember Logan was the March release or like the spring comic book movie release. And then this came out in like the summer as well. Marvel, I mean, Spider-Man came out in the summer of that 2017 as well. So you got like all that plus Guardians. Yeah, shit was crazy. And then you had Thor at the end of the year. 2017 was a great, great time, and it felt like Marvel was building up towards the Infinity War stuff. And then X-Men was trying to do its last stand with Wolverine, and then 20th Century Fox was trying to close out their Caesar, Planet of the Apes trilogy all in one year. Plus, there's a bunch of stuff we haven't mentioned, like Shape of Water came out that year as well, and we talked about that when in earlier episodes when we talked about Blade 2 and Guillermo del Toro and Hellboy and all that stuff. So one hell of a year, man. And I was looking back at the Oscars that year, or for 2018 for the 2017 movies slates, and it's a damn shame, man, because I felt like at least War of the Planet of the Apes deserved to get, at most best cinematography, best original score. It did get a nomination for the best visual effects, obviously, because I mean the effects are incredible in this movie. But yeah, it's just kind of disappointing that with all that stuff that came out that year, I felt like War kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit when it kind of deserved more love. I mean, even Logan got nominated for best adapted screenplay. I just felt like after watching this, man, the cinematography for this movie is so unbelievable that it got just robbed. It's just one of those things. And Michael Giacchino doing that amazing score where he's just doing everything based off the piano pretty much and doing this like really deep score. Just incredible stuff, and it got lost in the shuffle. But again, there's just so many loaded movies in 2017 that you can only nominate so much, which is kind of why I think that the Oscars should change their nomination scales and go more than 5 on some of these categories. They've already done it with Best Picture, but yeah, it's just kind of a shame because there's so much great work that went in this movie. It made its money, but I felt like it deserved that awards love that it should deserve, but it didn't get because it just didn't have the right campaign behind it. But that's just the way it is in Hollywood. But goddamn, this movie's fantastic, and I hate to say they get lost in the shuffle, but it did kind of get lost under all the Marvel stuff and all that stuff and the DC stuff. Justice League came out that year too, so just so much was going on in 2017.
We don't talk about Justice League on this show anymore.
Right, right. Well, I'm waiting 1 year from now, baby. HBO Max, Snyderverse, Snyder Cut. But we'll talk about that a year from now, maybe.
No,
We'll
we
see.
won't. I mean, if you want to, again, if you want to find someone to talk about it with, you are welcome to do that. I will not be participating in any Snyder Cut discussion.
We'll see a year from now. I'll try to get you to the dark side or the Snyder side.
No, that is not happening. I will not watch any more Zack Snyder DC related content. That is not happening. And you mentioned 2017 movies. I mean, you didn't even mention Get Out, Lady Bird. I mean, what else can you say? I mean, these
I forgot about
arguably might be two of the best movies of the year. And I mean, I think Get Out is a cultural phenomenon at this point, and is probably going to go down as one of the best and most important movies of the century. And yeah, it's easy to see why War for the Planet of the Apes got lost in the shuffle, because there's so much going on with Marvel and DC and some of the independent movies that this movie indeed did get lost in the shuffle. And while I think that is unfortunate, I do think that there is a lot to discuss with this movie. And we talk about the virus stuff. We talk about kind of the apes evolving. And in this, you see the apes have evolved even more. Caesar is talking in full sentences and is a much more a verbal character in this movie, whereas in the previous two, he was using kind of a mix of both. But what you also get in this movie is you get a very fervently anti-military message. I mean, that much is so clear from watching this movie, is that Matt Reeves is not somebody who is pro-military, because you see the actions of what they do, and even at the ending battle fight that goes on. I mean, what happens to both of those groups, Brian? They get basically stuck in an avalanche. So this is a movie that is called War for the Planet of the Apes, but it is very clearly not a pro-war movie.
Yeah, that's what I liked about this, because the way that going into this movie, you're thinking it's apes versus humans, but by the end, it's really like all these different factions going up against each other. You know what I mean? Because Woody Harrelson's faction of military men, they're against what the remaining government, or whatever government establishment was left. They went against that. They're a rogue military unit, and that is like, very crazy stuff, considering that, you know what I mean, like how dangerous that is. A rogue military unit out there causing trouble in a world where it's a post-apocalyptic world. So it sets up this crazy dynamic for the end, because you're thinking like, okay, why is there building a wall? Like, you try to ask yourself, why are they building a wall? Even Caesar's asking himself, why are they building a wall? And then when you find out that there's this other army coming to get them because they went rogue, it's just really interesting stuff. It's all, based on real life military shit that's gone on throughout history, and it makes sense. Rogue military units doing crazy shit. It happens in the real world, man, and this is truly one of those things that, it's a prime example of power getting too corrupt, and then being a military general, you know what I mean, and having that kind of power over a group of people who are submissive and willing to just listen to whatever you want and do whatever the bad things you want. And you can see that it really affects everyone else. You know what I mean? It's like a domino effect. So I don't know, just the way that the battle came towards a head at the end was really eye-opening, because like even by the end, the apes were not even in the midst of the battle. They were trying to get away from the battle. It wasn't even their war to fight at that point. So I thought it was really interesting that the way that they show like the humans just like fighting against each other when they should be trying to stick together and survive, like the apes were trying to stick together and survive. So it's an interesting contrast the way they put that together, I thought.
Well, and a lot of the focus is on apes that we have never seen before, and we spend a lot of time with a few chosen apes, including Caesar and Maurice. And they kind of, that group has their basically their own adventure, and they run into a bad ape, quote unquote, and interact with him, and that leads to the kind of the second half of the movie. And what I think you get this imagery of these apes in cages, and this is something that we saw in Rise, and again is kind of directly connected to what is happening in the modern times. And you mentioned this idea of the wall. I mean, walls have a history in the world. Think about, there is a Great Wall of China, There was the Berlin Wall. There is talk about building walls on the borders of between the United States and Mexico. So these are ideas that remain so incredibly relevant to today. And what you have in Woody Harrelson's character is, I mean, I couldn't help but think of someone he's basically Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now. I don't think that they're even trying to hide that's kind of the vibe that they're going for. This kind of Apocalypse Now kind of vibe where this guy has gone completely rogue and has gone completely insane, and even the mainstream military wants to take him down and things like that. And I think that's really powerful. And I mean, Woody Harrelson might not be the first person that you would think to play a role like this. In fact, you could make the argument that we've had 2 actors in this series already who maybe could have played this role, a Gary Oldman, a Brian Cox. But what you get is you get Woody Harrelson, and I mean, I think that his performance especially is spectacular. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. But I want to talk about a little bit of the background of this movie, because one of the ideas that originally was brought up is the possibility of bringing Koba back. And Koba is someone that we talked a lot about in the first 2 movies. And of course, he died at the end of the second movie. But there was talk of possibly bringing him back, and they had some ideas about how to possibly even bring him back from the dead, so to speak. But what they eventually decided was that Caesar would be traumatized by having to kill his brothers. So instead of just having this character reappear, which is something that we see a lot in genre movies where they're not really dead, and you're not dead unless you see literally a corpse. In this case, they brought him back, and it was just PTSD. And I think that is a great way to bring Koba back, because the idea of bringing him back is kind of pointless, because that's really not what this particular movie is about. But the role that he plays is an important one, because he is there to, quote unquote, haunt Caesar and give Caesar something to kind of work through in this movie.
Yeah, I love the use of Koba, because that's exactly how you should do it. I'm thinking, like, because we've talked about this, especially with like Black Panther and Killmonger, if there's a way to bring him back, but that seems to be the right move to do if you're going to do something like that with like Killmonger or Black Panther, because like this is the kind of like haunting and, you know, something that goes down in the sequel should have consequences in the third movie. I think like some of those rules should apply and have like consequences that affect the future sequels, and this is definitely one of those things that just haunts you, or haunts Caesar in this movie for sure. And then I'm pretty sure like they're gonna bring Koba back in other ways in the future ones, just to, you know, because historically they're gonna have to write down their history, and they're gonna have to know the name of Koba and what he did in starting the war. Like, I don't think it's gonna be one of those things where the apes are gonna erase their history just to put. I mean, they could. That'd be an interesting storyline to put Caesar in that light. But I think Koba's gonna be one of these characters down the line, because they got to make more movies in this franchise. It's such an open universe now. But I think that having Koba in that kind of use, being used as a historical figure now, that's going to even be more, you know, I think more powerful kind of thing. It's going to be kind of like the way that, you know, today, I hate to compare it again today, but like the way these Confederate statues, and we're honoring these past shitty generals from the Confederacy or something like that. But I think that's kind of way they're going to play it out in the future with Koba, is they're going to remember him as this kind of like war criminal kind of guy, or kind of ape. But, you know, someone is going to try to shape the narrative and try to make it seem like Koba was the, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the direction they're going to go, and they're going to use Caesar and Koba as like this Martin Luther King, Malcolm X kind of dynamic for future generations to reference to. And I think that's the way to go. If you brought back Koba like that, it would have just been this comic book kind of feel to it. And that doesn't match what they were trying to go for in this movie at all, I think. I think they were going for a realism, you know, real mental disorders, you know, really, you know, real trauma, and how that affects characters in the way that, you know, it's going to affect them in their lives later on. And that truly happens with Caesar. So I think that's a great dynamic to set up for the movie and then future movies to come.
So I mentioned the fact that Caesar has kind of evolved in his use of language. And that is perhaps one of the most impressive things, is that you see this natural evolution in the way that he speaks from Rise to Dawn to this movie. But what's happening on the other side, on the human side, is this concept of the simian flu. The virus has evolved itself, and it is rendering some of the surviving humans mute and mindless, and this foreshadows the events of the 1968 Planet of the Apes, if that's the direction that you want to go with. And I've always been more of a believer that this is kind of a rebooted version of the franchise and not necessarily prequels. I mean, they could certainly go in the direction of calling this prequels, but to me, I've always seen this as kind of a rebooted version of the franchise, especially with some of the names they've chosen to use. But the surviving human population in those movies, mute and primitive. Rise of the Planet of the Apes contained a brief news item about a lost space expedition, so that is also a reason that this could be seen as a possible prequel to the 1968 film, or they may just do a straight-up remake of Planet of the Apes at some point. But we also get a human character in this movie who is very familiar to those who have watched both Planet of the Apes and Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The characters, they refer to this young girl who is as Nova, and their existence is, of course, separated by 2,000 years. But Nova, just like the Nova of those films, is mute, and she is kind of an early representation of this disease and of the simian flu and how it evolves, and it becomes really important as we go along to understand that, you know, the human race, even the survivors, are now at risk for possibly becoming primitive beings and losing what makes them human. And I think that's also something that is very powerful, because I think it could have been very easy to make War for the Planet of the Apes just a war movie, and there are times when it is, but they have taken the thread of the virus and they've extended it through all three of these movies and made it relevant. And again, they've kind of echoed the previous movies in a way that doesn't feel like they're just kind of eating their own tail, which is, and I'm going to talk about this later when I talk about Matt Reeves, I think there are other franchises that have ended up doing that, but it doesn't feel like Planet of the Apes is eating its own tail.
Yeah, I love the way that they kind of set it up. It's like there's this natural evolution, and that kind of reflects the evolution of the apes throughout, you know, their history. So I love this idea that I think in the timeline, it's been 2 years between Dawn and War, but in that 2 years, like, he's talking like normal. So his brain is still like evolving, and all the other apes' brains are still evolving, because some of the other apes are starting to like increase their speech slowly and surely. So I love this natural evolution of what's, you know, eventually they're all going to be talking, you know, full sentences and standing up straight, but eventually, you know, but they're showing you how they got there. You know what I mean? So it's been like, I think it's 20 years, like Caesar's 20 years old at this point, and to see the evolution from him, how he learned sign language, to learning, you know, to using the word no for the first time in that powerful scene in Rise, to using the words that he did in Dawn, to now using full sentences. Like, it's a natural evolution that I thought was just making perfect sense, because they're literally showing you evolution before your very eyes, like, and then they're showing you the de-evolution of humans at the same time. So I'd love that little contrast and the details in that, because by this point I completely forgot that the humans went mute and stuff like that, and they went kind of feral. I completely forgot about that, because they were, you know, in Dawn they're just talking and everything's fine, and then once they introduced this concept that, you know, the remaining humans are starting to go mute, I was like, oh my god, they're finally like that. I forgot about that part, you know, and they're actually connecting it to the original, which I'm totally cool with. Like, I see these as like prequel, you know, reboots, which is fine. And then you can just do the Planet of the Apes movie the way that, you know, however you want to do it. Like, hopefully not like Tim Burton, but I totally see that, because as long as they keep it in the same universe and keep, you know, the same tone, I think they can pull it off really well. So I'm looking forward to that. And I do love the way they echo all the previous movies, the way you mentioned. And it's kind of becoming its own, which is great. And, you know, I just want this universe to kind of expand, you know what I mean? Because I don't want it to just be these three movies and then we have to reboot everything again. We have to get a new Caesar and all that. I don't want that. Like, I want to build this universe, because they put a lot of work into the world building, especially in the last two movies. They did a lot of world building. And I feel like they need to build on that so much, because there's this world that once they get to at the end, spoiler alert, to that valley or that desert, man, it's literally an open door of possibilities. You know what I mean? There's just so much going on. And then with Steve Zahn's character with Bad Ape coming in, I thought that was a great window of opportunity there as well, because he's the first one they met outside of their group that talks, and that it kind of explained my confusion last week, because I was like, how are these other apes talking, or is it going to spread or whatever? But apparently the disease goes from human to human, human to ape, and then back and forth. So that's how the other apes are getting contaminated, because the humans around the world are still having contact with these apes, and these apes are having contact with other apes. So it's becoming this natural evolution thing, and you're seeing everything kind of unfold to what the world that's going to set up in the original movie. You know what I mean? So I thought everything, the way they laid it down in the background, they did it subtly, I thought, too. You know what I mean? And with the Nova stuff, I thought it was a little too tongue-in-cheek again with the stuff they were doing with Rise and all the using the same lines as the original. But I was thinking about it. Maybe it's not necessarily supposed to be the same Nova. Maybe it's just a Nova of the past, because maybe since that point in time, Nova became like a regular human name that they would just call humans. So that kind of makes sense in my head. It's not necessarily the same Nova, but it's going to be, maybe a descendant of Nova. And I thought that the way they used the little girl, I don't know her name, but the little girl Nova, they did more with this Nova than the first two original movies with that Nova, because the original Nova was just like, let's face it, just 60s eye candy for Charlton Heston. You know what I mean? Just literally a background character for Charlton Heston to just look at because, it's a pretty girl, right? In this case, they literally did something with the character and did more with her than the previous female characters in the other two Apes movies in this trilogy. So at least they did that. You know what I mean? And because, again, Judy Greer didn't have much to do in this movie again, unfortunately, and she got killed off, unfortunately, fridged, whatever you want to call it in this case, because the son gets killed off too. But a lot of changes in this movie, but I love what they did to kind of plant the seeds for the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly a lot of possibilities in the future, but one of the things that I wanted to address, one of the interesting aspects of the movie that we really haven't discussed yet, is this idea of traitor apes, and it is alluded that some of the apes who were loyal to Koba kind of turned their backs and aligned with the humans just simply to go against Caesar. And there is an interesting name that is given to the apes. They are referred to as donkeys, and it's kind of, I mean, to me, the way I thought of it is it's like a slur, almost kind of a derogatory term, but funny enough, it is a direct reference to Donkey Kong and their use as pack animals. And I mean, that's tremendous. I don't know how they came up with that, but it's such an interesting idea because, I mean, everybody is aware of Donkey Kong. Even if they haven't played a Donkey Kong game in a while, there's a cultural awareness of the character because of the arcade game, because of Smash Brothers, because of Donkey Kong, the video games and whatnot. And I really appreciated that they kind of gave a purpose to the traitor apes, and it made the world, it contributed to the world building and made this feel like a very specific kind of attribute to this world. And I really like that because I think it's really easy in genre movies to just do things and to just have it feel like there's no purpose behind it. But it feels like, not only calling them donkeys, but having it spray painted on them gives it a clear purpose.
Yeah, that was some really good storytelling stuff right there. Because at first I was like, are they calling him donkey because they're just a helper? And then, being at my age, I saw Shrek, and you can't help but think of donkey. But then it's like the whole Donkey Kong reference thing, and it's just like, oh, wow, that's a good deep cut right there. You know what I mean? It's very smart the way they did that. And I like it when movies create their own terminology, you know what I mean? Like that kind of, when you create certain words or phrases that kind of fit that certain world, it makes it even more, not realistic, but more believable and legitimate. You know what I mean? When you kind of create these rules for a certain universe and terminology and stuff like that, the way that we use Star Wars terms when we refer to Star Wars movies and stuff like that. So I like it when when movies create their own lingo, so to speak, and then it becomes kind of this thing because, I mean, especially with the spray painting, I mean, obviously NWO, come on, wrestling fans, that's what I think of, but still, like, it's very degrading, and then you see the way that they're treated, and it's very much like this, I hate to say it, but it felt like watching, like, just like the slavery stuff when they got their own slaves to whip other slaves as a form of like control and dominance and stuff like that. And that's exactly what they were going for, especially the stuff when they're treating them like slaves to build the wall. So I thought that was very just like obvious what they were doing, but very like, very specific and appropriate, I thought, because that's the way they were treating them and the way that, our American history is shown. Like it's obvious and it's no surprise. You know what I mean? Just using a group of people that's been, been hurt, and like the Indians, like with the genocide and stuff like that, and the way the Americans take these groups of people and just kind of subjectify them, or subject them to, slavery and stuff like that, and then eventually, systematic racism, and that's kind of all ties together, and you kind of see the roots of that with stuff like this, with the stuff with Donkey, and like the way they're treated as slaves in the cages and stuff like that, and the fact that they had to ask for food and water. Like, just shit like that just was really, like, eye-opening stuff. And the fact that we know that these are apes, but they're trying to humanize them, and that's the point of it all. And then you kind of see this reflection of other cultures throughout history through those lenses. So I thought that was very powerful stuff.
Well, and I think that with science fiction, you're able to do that a lot more, and a lot more specifically than you are in almost more realistic movies, because I think it's sometimes hard for people to see that stuff. But when you couch it in it's Earth, but it's not really Earth, it's kind of this different version, I think you're able to get away with a lot more. You're able to use that imagery as more of an allegory and not something that is so direct. Whereas, we've had movies in the past and TV miniseries, something like Roots or 12 Years a Slave, where you do have some of that imagery, but it's a lot harder to get audiences to see that because it's so in their face, and it's literally things that have happened in the history of this country. But I think these Apes movies have always done that, and I think that goes back to even the 1968 version. And I think the only time that they've really gotten away with that was with the Tim Burton movie. I think the Tim Burton movie doesn't have nearly as much to say about this kind of stuff, and that's why I think ultimately it was an unsuccessful, at least from a creative standpoint. But I mean, you mentioned this idea of slavery and forced work. I mean, this is stuff that still happens today. And if you don't believe me, Brian, you probably know this better than anyone. Who are the people that fight wildfires in California?
I just found this out. I think they but they're using prisoners.
They use prisoners and pay them like $1 an hour to fight these wildfires. And one of the concerns with COVID is that because it is spread through prisons so quickly, that they may not have people to fight the fires. So this is stuff that is still happening in this country right now. And it is even happening in California, which is one of the top 25 economies in the world, and is also considered to be kind of this bastion of liberalism and kind of the left. And even California has this problem. So this is stuff that is still relevant to today. This is not something that just stopped all of a sudden in the 1860s when slavery ended. This is stuff that is still relevant to today. And maybe one day we'll get the hint, Brian. One day.
Hopefully, but maybe we just need a Caesar in our real world, so we'll see. But right now, we definitely have a villain that's stuck in the White House.
Yes. I think Woody Harrelson is a much more competent fascist, though, and we'll get to him in a second. But, I mean, you mentioned the visuals. I think the visuals are as good in this movie as ever. It doesn't feel like there was as much of a leap between Dawn and War. I think it just feels like it's still really, really outstanding. The things that I did appreciate, I really did enjoy the opening. It's not because of the visual effects, it's just because it makes it feel like a war movie. And even though this movie is called War for the Planet of the Apes, there's not a lot of action sequences. You get the opening battle, you get some stuff at the end, but you don't really get a lot of action. You do get, some the parts with the whipping, as you mentioned, and some of the running around. But you don't really get a lot of extended action sequences, and that's pretty unique for a summer blockbuster like this. But the action that you do see, I mean, it is shot incredibly well by Matt Reeves, and I mean, he just does a wonderful job of just getting across what's happening. And I really appreciated that Caesar definitely looks older. I mean, I think it would be really easy to just have Caesar either look similar or whatnot, but you could see more gray hair, and you could see his face looks a little more haggard, and he looks tired, quite frankly. And given the battles that he's fought, I can't blame him for being tired. But I mean, even the way the apes, because there's a lot more of the apes interacting with humans, particularly Caesar when he is interacting with Woody Harrelson's character, and I think that stuff definitely is all the more effective. So, I mean, the visuals for me are just as good, if not better than Dawn, and especially Rise.
Yeah, that opening sequence was just unbelievable to watch because I think they had to do it on a crane because the opening sequence is the soldiers going up the side of this hill, right? And then it's a hill, so you got to shoot it on an angle. B, they were doing these close-ups and zoom-ins on the names of the back of the soldiers' helmets, which is so like a Vietnam War type shit. And it's hard for me. Like, I've never watched Apocalypse Now, and I don't think I ever will, or Platoon, or like all those other Vietnam movies. They just break my heart, and I can't take it, and I just get this really emotional like rut after watching those kind of movies. So I don't, it's got hard for me. But seeing this stuff, and then the way they shot it, and then they were just zooming in and out of the names, and then panning back in a single camera take to do a wide shot of all the soldiers going up the hill. Like, they really laid this out well in terms of the cinematography. Like, I think they took it a step above in terms of the cinematography just because these images that they were able to put together. Like, I don't know, every time I saw Caesar on that horse, it felt like I was watching Clint Eastwood in one of those Man with No Name movies, which is what they were going for. Because I read, like, in some of the background when they were writing the script, like, they took like a month or something off before starting to write the script and just watched a bunch of like old movies in like a private theater, all the Apes movies, a bunch of Westerns, and a bunch of other Vietnam movies, and put this together. And the way I kind of see it, it's like the beginning is kind of like a Vietnam movie. The middle of the movie, the second act, is pretty much a Western with like outlaw Josie Wales type stuff going on. And the third part of the movie goes back to being this war movie. So I thought that was really interesting, of this combination of genres that they were able to put it together, and the way they were able to shoot it to reflect all these different genres. Because at the beginning, it feels like you're watching Apocalypse Now, Platoon, whatever. And then the second act feels like you're watching The Man with No Name. You know what I mean? On that horseback. And then with the dialogue, and hardly any dialogue going on, but the zoom in and the close-ups of the facial expressions and stuff like that. That's totally Sergio Leone spaghetti western type filmmaking right there, which is up my alley. So that's why I loved all that stuff, the way they shot it. And then, of course, you mentioned the detail. The amount of detail they went into in the Apes this time was unbelievable. Like, I couldn't believe that Maurice was not a real orangutan. I still can't believe it. But I don't know, man. It just looks super, super real, to the point where I thought they just trained an orangutan for Maurice this time around. It was just so unbelievable. And the interactions that Maurice has with Nova, and the visually, how it just seems seamless, and the way that she's just riding on the horse on his back, and it's just like, is that a real orangutan? Are you fooling me right now? Because that looks too real, even more real than when The Lion King came out last year. You know what I mean? I couldn't believe it. So I don't know what it is, but they just improved everything in terms of the visuals. Like, they stepped everything up, even the music, man. Michael Giacchino, like, just something about the way he uses the piano, and it's just so simple. Even in like the most like heavy action parts at the end, like, he's still using the piano a little bit, soft tones and stuff like that. So it was just well done visually, I thought. And I don't know, man, there's just some amazing shots in this movie. I'm just thinking, like, God damn, how did this movie not get nominated for best cinematography? Because, like, unbelievable. And it is what it is when it's you take movies like Man with No Name and you kind of steal those shots. Tarantino does it all the time, but I feel like we don't get enough of that, because the way that a lot of these movies are shot today, it's just shot very simple and basic. Like, Rise is shot very simple and basic, I think, in comparison before Matt Reeves took over. And when Matt Reeves took over, it became this whole cinematic experience to another level. And then it becomes this other level and more the way he shoots it, man. So I was just impressed all around. I think the script's really good, but I think it's just the way that they laid it out. Like, I can tell in Matt Reeves' head that they just laid this out like on a specifically all the shots, the way they wanted to do it, but like took it from all these different classic movies.
Yeah, Michael Giacchino probably doesn't get enough credit for the scores that he's done. I mean, we've talked about him a number of times when we talked about him for Spider-Man, the latter Spider-Man movies, The Incredibles, very notably. So he is definitely someone that should get a lot of credit for what he does. And I think that the other thing that's so impressive about this movie, it's really time to have the Woody Harrelson conversation. Woody Harrelson plays the general in this, or the lieutenant. Actually, he's a colonel, Colonel J. Wesley McCullough. And this character of McCullough, we see him kind of early on in the movie, and literally all we know that he does, we don't even see this, but he kills Caesar's wife and son. So right away, this is a bad man. This is somebody who we want to see Caesar get his revenge on. And a lot of the exposition of this movie and a lot of the information that we find out about the humans comes from Woody Harrelson's character, because so many of the humans that we do have, Nova most notably, they can't speak. So it's so hard to play the villain, but also to actually have to explain what's going on, because normally you have a scientist or a lawyer or a news anchor. They're the ones that are explaining what's going on. But in this case, you have the antagonist of the movie having to explain what is happening. And he is the one that lays out the fact that he had to kill his own son. So they also couch it in a very emotional terms as well, because of what McCullough has had to do. And the thing that I've always appreciated about the antagonists, and McCullough is by far the worst of the three, or of all the major antagonists, and there have been more than three, there's been a bunch in each movie, but he is clearly the worst. We know this because of the way that he just kills his wife, Caesar's wife and son, the way that he treats his own men, the way that he treats the apes. This is not a good person. But Woody Harrelson is able to just command things so well. And you think about Woody Harrelson's career, the way he started on Cheers. He started as Coach's replacement, kind of an idiot almost. But then you see him evolve into other movies where he's in White Men Can't Jump, Natural Born Killers, Play It to the Bone. He's played such a wide variety of characters at this point. And, you know, Zombieland especially. Zombieland might be one of his best performances. But in this movie, he's so evil. And he gets it across so well. And again, when it comes to genre movies, they don't really get a lot of Academy Award nominations. And I'm not even sure, given the year that was in 2017, that he deserved one. But I think one of the main reasons that this movie is so effective is because Woody Harrelson does such a tremendous job throughout of just being an asshole. And that's important because Caesar is certainly not a perfect ape. He has killed before. He wants to kill Wesley McCullough. And I think at a certain point in the movie, you're kind of rooting for Caesar to do this. And the only way that you can have such a rooting interest in the apes and their escape, because again, a lot of the apes are anonymous in this movie. We don't really know a lot about the apes that are in cages. You need somebody to be as evil as Woody Harrelson is. And I think he's the one that really, from an acting standpoint, from a story standpoint, he's the one that makes this movie work.
I'm glad they didn't do like this over the top hokey kind of like villain, like twirling mustache type of villain. Like it's kind of tragic the way they lay his character out, because he is an evil son of a bitch. Let's face it. But was he like that before he killed his son? I don't know. They don't really imply that, but you would kind of think that whatever it was inside of him maybe before his son, you know, died. So maybe that darkness was already in him. But he lays it out saying that, you know, I did this to kind of save humanity or what is left, and you would have done the same thing in my position. And Caesar just looks at him. And I don't know if Caesar agreed with him or not in that point. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's very gray area in terms of that kind of thing, because the way he's describing it, I mean, do you kill those soldiers? Do you kill your son? Do you just abandon them? You know, because you're risking quarantine and infection and all that thing. And again, this idea of risking infection. So it's, to me, like, he is an evil son of a bitch, but those decisions were very much like, well, I don't know what to do in that situation. You know what I mean? So the way that his character's laid out, his evil path, that's kind of the way it goes sometimes in a world gone mad, and you have to make these kind of decisions. So it kind of just opens your eyes a little bit and what people can become when thrown in a situation where it's like the world is up against you. You know what I mean? So it's very much a reflection of that, I thought. Because, like I said, he could have just been, so over the top and hokey. You know what I mean? But he played it with this kind of realism and like pain, and that like you can tell like there's this pain behind the sunglasses kind of effect going on because of that thing that went on with the sun, and they had to kill him and whatever. But I do like the fact that I wouldn't say it's anticlimactic because there wasn't this big like duel between the two of Caesar and McCullough. You know what I mean? It just ends with him, succumbing to this disease that he tried so hard to quarantine and fight against. So that was kind of a really powerful moment as well, where basically instead of like a bullet or like guns or like violence taking down McCullough, it was a little girl's doll that took him down. So I thought that was a really cool element to that as well.
Well, a bullet does take him down. I mean, he commits suicide very clearly, but I get what you're saying. I mean, it's not...
You get what I mean. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, that, the disease is what really killed him. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, he killed himself eventually, but the disease would have, had him succumb, and he would not have fought it. You know what I mean? Like, he would have just let it take it over him, I think. But I thought that was a really cool, like, powerful thing, And the other thing, too, is, like, why didn't he just kill Caesar right off the bat? And I was trying to figure it out, and then I realized he can't, because if you kill Caesar, he's going to lose his workforce. They're going to turn on him, and they're going to riot. He needs Caesar alive for them to be controlled, to build this wall. So I thought, okay, I figured it out now. He can't kill him because he needs him as a symbol to keep these people going, to keep the apes going, to keep them to make the wall. So I was like, oh wow, that's kind of like, okay, it's not as easy as it sounds. Like, oh, why don't we just shoot Caesar? You're just talking to him and giving away all the plot. But he's telling him all these things so that Caesar knows that what's going on, and I think he's trying to like get Caesar on the same kind of wavelength that like you in the same situation would do the same as me, blah blah blah. But again, I don't know in that same situation if Caesar would have killed his wife and son.
Certainly a lot of questions raised by the situation, and I think that we are meant to think that McCullough's death is almost a tragedy. As evil as he has been, the reality is that this is a horrific disease, and I don't think that we're meant to take pleasure in it. And I think this is a movie that does not want you to take pleasure in anything that's happening. And I think that goes for the final battle scene as well. I think that there are so many movies like we've talked about where the action, we're supposed to revel in how good it is, with the John Wick movies, with the Raid movies. And I'm not taking cheap shots at Matt and Ben for talking about this, but those movies have a very clear and specific purpose. They're treating action and fight sequences like art. These are treating it like it's the most horrific thing in the world. They're trying to talk about war in such a way that makes sense and just how horrific it actually is. And I think they get that across by what happens, because this military group comes and they take out McCullough's group, but then they get stuck under an avalanche. And as it turns out, the only people who live are the people who are nonviolent. It's the apes who survive. I mean, all the apes have gone across the mountain and found their paradise. And eventually there are a lot more apes. I mean, the number of apes probably doubles given all the apes that were in cages. But I couldn't help on the rewatch but think about this movie and the way that it connects to Logan, because I think they're kind of going for the same thing at the end, with Caesar not quite getting to the promised land and succumbing to his injuries, and Logan kind of does the same thing in the 2017 movie. I mean, this movie came out just a few months later, and I don't remember seeing a lot of articles at the time connecting it, but I think you definitely can see the connections between the end of Logan and the end of this movie, because Caesar does succumb. He dies at the end of this movie, and he is a martyr, and he died for the cause. He died so that, and it wasn't just that he saved his family and the apes that he knew, but he saved a lot of apes that he didn't know. And I think that's the message that they're trying to get across, that he wasn't just the leader of a group, he was the leader of all the apes. And I think that's a very powerful message. And I think his death scene is very powerful. The fact that he is in conversation with Maurice, and as we know, the orangutans are the ones who kind of become the politicians and the leaders of the apes. So I think it works if you're trying to continue the story, but I think it also works because we have seen Caesar's entire life. We saw him literally from when he was a very, very young ape, and we see him die. And I think that's great that we get to see his entire journey. That's what this trilogy is about. And I think if they had gotten away from it, I think some of the power would have been lost. But ultimately, this is Caesar's trilogy. That's almost what I think we should refer to it as. Instead of the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy, this is kind of the Caesar trilogy.
That's exactly how I see it too, because we keep referring to them as like prequels and stuff, but to me, this is like a new, it's a new timeline, so to speak. And just seeing everything that we've heard about, like in the original 5 movies, you always heard stuff about Caesar, and then when they kind of redid it in 3, 4, and 5 of conquest or not, escape, conquest, and battle, right? You see this different journey that Caesar takes, but I think this journey that Caesar takes is even more, tragic and dark and all that kind of thing. Because the way they did it in the originals, like, they kind of like family friendly did. You know what I mean? Like, they made it too, campy and presentable. This is like the dark and grittiness of it all, and I'm glad they did it this way, because like by the end, you're right. Because I felt the Logan thing too. Like, I felt like this feels like the ending of Logan. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he gets the ex-kids to New Mexico or whatever. In this case, it's probably, I think it's Utah, I want to say, maybe. I don't know, somewhere around that area. And like, basically, the promised land. You're right. It's taking the people to the promised land and seeing his journey, and then you forget that he got stabbed, or not stabbed, but he got shot with an arrow on the side. And then by that moment, you realize, oh my God, they're gonna kill him right now. And Maurice is just about to break down. But I do love the fact that he's talking to Maurice on top of that higher plane, because again, that goes back to the second movie where they're at the beginning of the movie and talking, and they're on that cliff, and they're talking, and then Caesar's like, man, look how far we've come. And again, it comes full circle, and they're going back up on that elevated plane, and they're kind of looking back and like, well, look how far we've come. And I thought that was great storytelling. So, yeah, they just did a great job, man. I'm glad it was just 3 movies. It's what it needed to be. Caesar's 20 years old. He dies at 20. I looked it up. Apes have like a lifespan of about 50 years. So him being war-torn, weary, and living only 20 years, that makes sense because he's gone through so much shit, even though he looks like he's a 40-year-old ape. But just a tremendous job, and I felt like Andy Serkis, I don't know, just something about his eyes, especially in this movie, like he just sells so much with his eyes, or acts so well with his eyes, that it's unbelievable, man. I wish they had the digital category for acting.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly make that argument as well. As far as what doesn't work, I've really only got a couple things here, and I think they're minor complaints at best. Poor Judy Greer. Can we please get Judy Greer in a romantic comedy where she is the lead? Please. I mean, it's just ridiculous at this point, because it's not just that Cornelia bites it in the first 15 minutes of this movie, but it's also the fact that Judy Greer is the mom in every goddamn movie, and it's infuriating. Like, Archer's like the only thing where she gets to be a character, and it's very, very frustrating to me. I just wish Cornelia and the female apes had gotten a little bit more love, because these sets of movies are very patriarchal.
Well, I mean, Halloween Kills is scheduled for next year, but at least she got a lot more to do in Halloween, so I'll give it that. Because that's the only thing I can think of where she did a lot more than just be in the background being a mom. And that was very recent, and that she was a mom in that, but they kind of played it up as like this badass kind of mom based on being the daughter of Jamie Lee Curtis from Halloween.
And the other thing, so they introduced this gorilla, a very white gorilla named Winter, and they have him immediately turn on everyone. I get what they were doing, but it's one of those things where you have Koba turn on Caesar, you have Winter turn on Caesar. It's one of those things, you're the one that always likes to make the wrestling references, but it's my turn. You remember the wrestler Sting? Oh
my God, he's one of my top faves, dude. Of course.
Well, you know how how Sting got turned on like a bajillion times?
Yes, we know that Ric Flair likes to turn on Sting all the time and does it every
But
4
it
or
wasn't
5
just Ric
years.
Flair. Lex Luger did it. I mean, there were a lot of wrestlers, they just turned on Sting. And you get to a certain point, it's just like, can we please stop having people turn on Sting? So that's kind of what I was feeling in this moment when they have Winter immediately be introduced and just turn his back on the Apes. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying the donkeys were bad, but I'm just saying Winter specifically just being introduced in this way, only to immediately turn. I wish there had been more setup, perhaps in Dawn or something, so that we would have gotten to know Winter just beyond this.
Yeah, because we mentioned last week that I kind of compared Caesar to Vito Corleone, or maybe even Michael Corleone, but this was definitely that Fredo moment when he chokes him out and kills him, and he didn't mean to kill him, I don't think, but like it was one of those things where, God, it reminded me of that. I don't watch MASH, but I've seen that scene from MASH where the doctor describes how that baby died. Do you remember? You know what I'm talking about?
I do, yes. I am not as familiar with MASH as I probably should be, but I know what you're talking about.
So basically, he describes the scene in the last episode of MASH where he's in this car and this baby's crying, but it's, there's these soldiers around and they're hiding in the truck, so they have to keep the baby quiet. And this woman just smothers the baby and kills the baby, and it just traumatizes the doctor and the thing. They do the same thing here because he's trying to be quiet. They're in the military base and they're trying to talk to Winter. And then as soon as the guards come, they just, he's starting to scream and they start choking him out. And I was just like, God, it was tough to watch, man, because you see that Winter was just like this scared, traumatized ape that was tortured, and he's going through a lot of shit and he doesn't know what he's doing and he makes the wrong decision and he gets choked and killed for it. So that was a tragic moment, but I wish you're right. Like they needed to more establish that character before the turn, you know what I mean? Because they didn't introduce him at all in the second one or the first one. So I thought that was, it was interesting the way they did it, and I thought it was well done. But I just wanted maybe more like a 5-10 minute build up of that character beforehand, so we know that it makes sense for what that character did. But I see that, that's a good point you make as a good critique, because they didn't have time to establish him. And this movie is like 2 hours and 20 minutes, so even 5 more minutes I think would have been done service to that, but they didn't do that. But unfortunately, that's kind of what I'm at with the critique as well. And the other thing about I want to bring up Judy Greer again, just because I feel like it's so fucked up that I don't know. She had like no lines of dialogue in 2 movies, man. But I don't know what it is. I don't know what the thinking was. Maybe it was on accident. I don't know. But at least I don't know. At least we got Nova, So at least they kind of made up for that, because I thought the little girl as Nova did a good job. But other than that, those are kind of like the 2 critiques. I can't really think of anything else other than maybe it was just a little too long at some sequences towards the end. Maybe a little too, let's get this beautiful shot in here, this beautiful shot here. Maybe a little too much of that, because I know, look, I've watched a lot of Sergio Leone movies, and he does do a lot of excessive, over-the-top, great cinematography shots when you don't necessarily need like 15 minutes of like staring at these dudes' eyes in close-ups and stuff like that. But it's a little, overindulgent, but it was not too long. You know what I mean? If it was another 10 minutes of overindulgent, like great cinematography, then I would start complaining, because I love the cinematography, but I do think don't go over the top and don't go too long and waste your time. So they didn't overstay their welcome in terms of that.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. I think there are times with it being 2 hours and 20 minutes, I think you're always going to feel that a lot more, because in a movie like this, when I'm not going to say the plot was limited, but the world definitely feels a lot smaller than it did in the second one, at least kind of the sets and what they're working with. I think it feels a lot smaller, even though I think in some ways it's also a little bit on the episodic side. And for the most part, I think it works, but I think there are definitely, in a movie like this, I think there's always things that you could cut and make it just a little bit tighter. But overall, I think this is a smashing success, and I think it's time to talk about our MVP. So I'm going to let you go first. Who is your MVP?
I'm going with Michael Sorensen. He's the director of photography, cinematographer for both movies. He's like 77 years old, man, but he's done some good stuff in his history. Your favorite Harry Potter movie, Prisoner of Azkaban, he shot that. And that's the only Harry Potter movie he shot. And you can tell it's the most different looking Harry Potter movie. And you can tell this guy has a different eye for things, and I'm glad that he worked with Matt Reeves on this, even though he's not working on the Batman, unfortunately. So I think that we'll see how that plays out, but I think Matt Reeves still has that eye that he can use another cinematographer to get that visual style that he wants. But something about this guy in these two Apes movies that just knocked the socks out of me in terms of what he was doing with the colors and the way the camera moved and the positioning of the cameras and all that kind of thing. I felt like I had this complaint about Rise where they didn't get the scale down about the heights and stuff, about how tall Caesar is and all that kind of thing. But I felt like the way he shot the latter two movies, it fixed that problem and added to it and added layers to the cinematography and made the woods look incredible. And the desert at the end looked incredible, just the way he shot the whole movie. And even the last shot of the movie that they chose kind of leads into this, what we've been talking about, a potential, because the last shot of the movie, they pan up to the sky. Why else would you pan up to the sky unless you're not referencing the fucking spaceship that's been up there that leads to the original Planet of the Apes? So that's kind of the way I'm thinking. And the way that he did that and put everything together, fantastic stuff. I know Matt Reeves was my MVP last week. I almost went with Saracen last week as my MVP, but I felt like this movie stepped it up completely and made it even more epic, cinematic, through all those old school feels, like I mentioned, the Clint Eastwood stuff, the Vietnam War movie stuff, tying that all together into this unique kind of feel and experience. I thought he did a great job. Michael Giacchino, I'll probably put him as number 3 or 2, because again, Let's Score, tremendous stuff, but just the cinematography, I thought, just transformed the whole experience as a whole.
Yeah, I think giving the cinematographer credit, I'm glad that we kind of went in different directions. And for me, I really wanted to give Matt Reeves at least one of these two, because I think that as good as Rise was, and I think that is a movie that could very easily be kind of left by the wayside, but that's a very good movie. I think it's well directed. I think there are a lot of really good scenes in it. But Dawn and War are just on another level. And I think Matt Reeves is the reason that these movies take it to another level, because there's a very clear difference in the way that the movie looks, the way it's shot, the way it's written. Matt Reeves does have screenplay credits on both of these movies. And I think it definitely comes across like Matt Reeves had a lot to do with this remaining a story about Caesar. So I think that's really important, and that's not something that should be underestimated, because they could have taken this in a lot of directions, maybe even building up to a Planet of the Apes remake. Perhaps that's what they had in mind with this trilogy at the start, but I think you got something very different, and I think you got something that should be very well remembered and well regarded. And I think that when we talk about the Batman, whenever the Batman eventually comes out, I think we need to talk about Matt Reeves in a way that this is not a newly discovered director. This is somebody who has proven himself, and he proved himself on these two movies. He directed Cloverfield, which is a movie that I have mixed feelings about, but I certainly think there's a lot of good direction in it. And I feel very similarly about Let the Right One In, which I don't think is a perfect remake, but I still think that there's a lot of really good elements in it. At what I think Matt Reeves has been able to do, and it's funny because when we talk about Matt Reeves and we talk about Damon Lindelof, we have to talk about these two people as collaborators of J.J. Abrams. Matt Reeves is somebody who has directed a number of J.J. Abrams products, including Cloverfield, and Damon Lindelof was a major collaborator on Lost. And what's so fascinating to me is you think about where Damon Lindelof has gone and where Matt Reeves have gone. They've gone in very, very different directions compared to J.J. Abrams. And to me, I've seen Matt Reeves evolve as a filmmaker from Cloverfield to Let the Right One In to the Apes movies, and now he's going to get to do Batman. And obviously, he's playing in genre, and I think that what he's doing is his style is elevating these genre movies, and I think he's going to do the same thing with Batman. I think those movies are going to be very different from the Nolan movies, but I think they're going to feel much closer to the comic books in a way. Just like I think these 8 movies feel like 8 movies and not just, either animated or about the humans and there's a couple of apes. So Matt Reeves has kind of elevated genre and kind of separated himself from J.J. Abrams in that way. And Damon Lindelof, I mean, look at how relevant Watchmen is. Even in 2020, it feels more relevant now in 2020 than it did even 8 months ago when it came out on HBO. So it's fascinating to see these two people and the creativity that they've been able to find. And it feels like J.J. Abrams is still in his mystery box. And it's fascinating to see how that works sometimes, because I have a lot of respect for what Matt Reeves and Damon Lindelof have done. And let's just say I'm not going to be going to see J.J. Abrams movies anytime soon. So that is my long explanation of why Matt Reeves is the MVP of War for the Planet of the Apes. Brian, best performance.
I got to go with Andy Serkis again. And I know I picked him for the first movie, but goddamn, like I mentioned, his eyes. Something about the way that he just performs with his eyes. And it's not just the Apes movies. Even in Black Panther, there was some moments in Black Panther where he just gives these looks, and you can tell, like, oh, this is this is someone you do not trust, and he's an evil son of a bitch when he was playing Claw. But I don't know what it is, but he's such a great actor. Even I'll even throw this in there. Like in King Kong, right? There's that scene where he finds they go down that pit, and then he finds his friend at the bottom dead, and then the way he just looks, it just looks like he just gave the best acting performance in that whole movie in that 10 seconds. When he's just crying over his friend in King Kong. I don't know what it is, but Andy Serkis is just so tremendously well-versed. And, he's becoming a director now. He's, producing his own stuff. And he's directing the Venom movie. And he's still going to be, motion capturing in different movies probably. And God knows what's on his plate next. But he's just so talented. And I can't believe that he's never gotten an Oscar nomination at this point. For all that he's done, it's like, God damn, he deserves more. But... another little side note, Michael Sorensen, the cinematographer I mentioned, he did the cinematography for Mowgli, which was directed by Andy Serkis. So everyone's just kind of pairing up and sticking together with what works. So good for them. Andy Serkis is the man. And I don't know. It just felt like I don't know. I wish that he could have gotten an Oscar nomination for this, but I don't see how the Oscars can nominate him. But they got to make new rules that are not as restrictive, I think.
What if he gets nominated for Best Director for Venom 2?
I will be shocked completely, because that would be, wow. You could put money on that one and see how well that plays out. But I'm not betting on that. Despite how crazy my bets get, I can't bet on that.
Can you imagine if Venom 2 is actually good? Then he deserves. If he makes Venom 2 good, he deserves an Oscar nomination, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Woody Harrelson is in it as well, so everything, like I said, coming back together and sticking together to make what's good.
And that is my best performer. You mentioned his name, Woody Harrelson. I think Andy Serkis is spectacular in this movie, and that's why I think he was the MVP of the first one. But again, I think from a storytelling perspective, I think Woody Harrelson's the one that makes this work, because I think for if you're going to call a movie War for the Planet of the Apes, and I certainly have discussed the fact that I think these movies are incorrectly titled, but if you're going to do that, you need to have a really good villain, and McCullough is a wonderful, wonderful villain, and he does an incredible job, and I have a deep admiration for what Woody Harrelson's able to do. And he's one of these guys, again, that has just been in such a wide variety of stuff, and he's been such a good performer in a lot of movies and television shows. Cheers, True Detective, White Men Can't Jump, the Hunger Games series. I mean, this guy has been in such a wide variety of films, and he did a really good job. So all the credit to him. And I believe, Brian, that is going to wrap up our conversation on War for the Planet of the Apes. I'm also giving this a 9. I think this is the best movie of the franchise, though.
Definitely of the trilogy. In terms of all the 8 movies, I'd say this is number 2 behind the original. And that's saying a lot, And I would say Dawn is probably number 3. I have a personal love for Escape, so I'll put that before Rise. But those are kind of like my top 5, and you can kind of figure it out from there. Probably on the end of that top 5 is probably Conquest, because we mentioned that 2 weeks ago as being an underrated movie that kind of stands the test of time for being what it was. So in terms of that, that's kind of how I rank the movies. A little side note: I am a fan of Woody Harrelson in Cheers, more so than, I don't know. I feel bad for saying this, but I thought he was funnier than Coach, and I think God, I'm going to get some flack for this too, but I think the best dynamic that Cheers had was, I'm going to say it out loud, Rebecca, Woody, and Sam. There you go.
I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I think with the show, the way the show evolved, I think it made a lot more sense for Woody to be a part of Cheers than Coach, especially once Shelley Long left the show. I think having Woody there was better than having Coach there. But I don't know. I have very conflicting feelings on that because he was very good. Coach was such a great character on that show and the way that he was able to play off everyone. But this is not a Cheers podcast. This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast that looks at movies. And Brian and I have talked a lot of genre movies, staying a lot with superhero movies, fantasy. Last month, we kind of looked at a little bit of sci-fi. This month with Planet of the Apes. But next month, we are going in a very different direction. We are talking about straight comedies. We have not done a lot of that on this podcast. And really, EnterTheRealWorld.com has not done a lot of discussions about comedies. But that's going to change next month as we're going to take a look at one of the very few comedic trilogies. You don't see a lot of these. But we are going to talk about Beverly Hills Cop, the Eddie Murphy-led series that encompassed 1984's Beverly Hills Cop 1, Beverly Hills Cop 2, which came out in 1987 and is directed by the great Tony Scott, and, of course, 1993's Beverly Hills Cop 3, which is let's just say, a major step down from the previous two movies. But I am very excited to talk about comedies next week and the following week after because Eddie Murphy is someone that I have really enjoyed, and one of the unfortunate aspects of this of COVID-19 is that we are having to take a break from the Eddie Murphy-sance that has been taking place over the last few months with for the Netflix movie that he did, returning to SNL, possibly coming back to stand-up. That's it's very exciting that Eddie Murphy's kind of relevant right now, but we're going to be going back and talking about probably his most successful franchise.
Totally. And God, it's so crazy that it's to say this, but I watched this on VHS as a kid, and like it was not even like that far. It was like 2002. You know what I mean? And I was watching it on VHS and it was like directly the VHS from the 80s at my local video store. And I watched it like 3 times, man. I love Beverly Hills Cop 1. I don't know what it is, but I can't wait to relive it all. But that, and wow, we get to talk about Bronson Pinchot, for Christ's sake. So there you go.
Absolutely. So that is what we are doing in 2 weeks. Next week, though, in this spot, you are going to hear Kevin Ford and we discuss the Netflix movie El Camino, which is kind of an epilogue to the Breaking Bad series, as we are going to be focusing a lot of our attention on Jesse Pinkman. So definitely make sure you check that out next week. And then in 2 weeks, we will be discussing the first Beverly Hills Cop and going through the rest of the series. For Brian, my name is Jerome Cusan. Again, thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again in 2 weeks.
So when McCullough gets to Caesar's treehouse at the beginning, do you think he said, what do you think they got in there, King Kong?